Scottsdale Councilman Guy Phillips. Thank you for watching this segment of Perspectives. This is the first of a three-part series on Scottsdale and their land use policies. With me today is Howard Myers, a resident and active citizen of Scottsdale. Howard has served on the Preserve Commission for 9 years and over 12 years in the Preserve subcommittees. In addition, he has served 5 years on the Board of Adjustment, the Desert Foothills Character Area Committee, and the General Plan Committee, and active in the city's Environmentally Sensitive Land Ordinance, the ESLO, which we're going to be talking about. And also with us is Scottsdale's Preserve Director, Croy Ekblaw. Croy previously worked over 20 years in planning and development for the city and has experience with ESLO and the precursor to ESLO, the Hillside Ordinance. Both have had natural area open space requirements. Over the past 12 years, Croy has worked on strategic projects related to state trust lands, Major League Baseball at Scottsdale Stadium, and acquiring land and developing trails and trailheads in Scottsdale's McDowell Sonoran Preserve. So we're here today because as a city councilman, I frequently get questions from our constituents and property owners about what Scottsdale's ESLO and NAOS designations mean and how that affects their property. So let's get to it. So my first question will be to Mr. Ekblaw. Croy, can you explain to our audience and future property owners what NAOS, open space, and ESLO mean?
Great. I'll start with the Environmentally Sensitive Lands Ordinance, sort out this alphabet soup. So ESL, Environmental Sensitive Lands Ordinance. That ordinance is an overlay district. That means that if you own a single family house in Scottsdale, it's typically zoned residential. And then an overlay district is on top of that identifies some additional requirements or restrictions on the use of land. An environmental sensitive land ordinance speaks very much to the word environmental and sensitive, that the lands that in the northern part of Scottsdale have been identified with this overlay, and properties in that area have additional requirements to meet. And under Environmental Sensitive Lands Ordinance, natural area open space, or the NAOS, that the other part of the alphabet soup here, is a requirement that comes from within the ESL. And basically, it's a certain percentage of your property is to be set aside in its natural state. And of course, we live in the Sonoran Desert, and a northern 2/3 of Scottsdale, more or less, is identified or has the ESL overlay on it. And properties up there, so residents who live north of the CAP canal or the major power lines up there, quite often have a natural area open space easement on their property, or if they're looking to build a house, they're going to be required to provide one
So
with
you're
them.
saying ESLO is generally everything north of the CAP canal?
It's north of the power line corridor.
Yeah, you have both the canal and the power line corridor
Okay.
define that. So properties up there, and certainly the McDowell Mountains and all the way up into the Desert Mountain area and out East Shea, out towards the Mayo Clinic and Scottsdale Mountain Estates, all of those properties are within the Environmental Sensitive Lands District. So properties out there are required to do a number of different things. It has additional height restrictions within the ESLO, but specific to what is NAOS then, natural area open space, and the calculation of that is based upon just how sensitive the land is. And sensitivity comes about from how steep are the slopes, whether you're in a lower upper desert landform, whether there's boulder outcrops on the property, things like that can lead to the calculation. But generally, percent of slope, how steep the property is the strongest determinant as to how much property you have to set aside. And quite often, 20 to 40% of a property can be required to be set aside. There's some a little less, some a little more. In some properties, or in a subdivision approach, they may master plan that NAOS, and some of the NAOS is done in a community tract or open space basis, and not as much or none on the individual developed properties. But in many cases, larger lot, acre properties or larger, quite often an individual who has that property has an easement on their property that defines 20, 30, 40% of their property as natural area open space, and the expectation is that it remains as Sonoran Desert and left in its natural state. It helps the wildlife, it helps drainage, help minimize the amount of increased drainage that occurs from having roofs and driveways. Things of that nature are all included then by the protection of natural area open space.
Okay, so I hope our listeners understand that. It gets a little confusing because you have environmentally sensitive land ordinance, which is everything north of the CIP you're talking about, but at the same time you have this NAOS, which is a natural area open space.
Right.
So if anybody buys property, whether it's a private homeowner or a developer, everything north of the CIP, you're subject to both?
Well, you're subject to ESL, and
Right.
then the NAOS is one of the requirements.
One of
So
number.
if we look at the NAOS as like a sub-requirement of the ESL, which you're
Right.
already going to have. So you can expect when you buy property that, because if you're north of that area, you're in that ESLO area, you will have some kind of requirement for NAOS.
That's correct.
Okay, among other things.
One other thing.
Okay. So Howard, can you tell us what your perspective of the history behind these ordinances and how they came to be? Croy did mention about the Hillside Ordinance. I think that precursor.
Yeah,
is,
the Hillside Ordinance was before ESLO. Really, it was city leaders back then, I think, had a lot of foresight, and they saw that the Upper Sonoran Desert that we are fortunate enough to have, mainly because of the McDowell Mountains, which allows more water to drop there, was a real asset in many respects. It's not just the environment itself, but it draws tourists here. And in fact, I live up Scottsdale Road. You'll see a lot of people drive up Scottsdale Road, pull off the side of the road, get out, take a picture by Saguaro, a picture by looking at the mountains in the background. And so they realized that this was a real jewel that Scottsdale had, and actually then they went out and annexed some more of it, so they had the area all the way up to the Tonto National Forest eventually. And they realized that they had to do something, they should do something to protect that, or else they'll lose it all to development, and then people won't come to see it anymore because it won't be there. And actually living with the environment has a tremendous number of advantages. You know, people now are looking at desert environments saying, how do we live in them and all that? Well, the city, I think, showed a lot of foresight in doing something like this to tell you exactly how to live in the desert and live with it instead of trying to transform it into something else. So it was part of an overall bigger plan. There's a lot of things that went into the plan. The Hillside Ordinance was the first attempt to, and that was because they saw development approaching the McDowell Mountains, and everybody in Scottsdale loves the McDowells as they are without any homes on them. So they say, well, we have to do something to try to protect that, but it's also the foothills of the McDowells, not just the mountains themselves. So the Hillside Ordinance was the first attempt, and I think that was back in 1997, but it was eventually 10 years later struck down in courts because some property owners challenged it, saying it was too limited on what they can do with their property and all this sort of thing. Well, the city didn't give up, thank God, and they, you know, ESLO was the next step in that to try to form another ordinance that would take into account what your entitlements are to build on a property, at the same time trying to preserve the desert. And ESLO has a lot more things in it, actually, in the Hillside Ordinance to do that. And again, as part of an overall strategy, the preserve is part of the strategy, the environmentally sensitive lands ordinance is part of the strategy. Our scenic corridors is another thing that kind of came out of this whole thing, as another part of the story, because if you drive up Scottsdale Road or Pima, you will see that there's bigger setbacks there, and it's all natural vegetation. And by controlling height also, you don't see development. What you see is a desert. And that was the idea, that's what they want visitors to see, but also residents. And I could tell you, it's a far different environment, and one that I personally love, because you drive up that road and all you see is desert. That's what you want to see. You don't want to see high rises and buildings and all this other sort of stuff. So the overall plan included ESLO and the Sonoran Preserve, and then they did native plant ordinances and stuff like that to control what sorts of plants you could use. And ESLO has a lot of requirements in it besides just NAOS. And NAOS you have to leave entirely alone. You don't even take out dead material or anything. If something falls in there, you leave it because it's animal habitat. But beyond that, they controlled heights, and now residential units are limited to 24 feet in height, and that's because the natural desert canopy is about 24 feet of the trees. Saguaros obviously will be bigger than that, but saguaros don't block your view, the trees do. And in addition to height, they limited color. There's a whole color scheme that you have to meet, an LRV, light reflectance value, of no greater than 35%. So your house can't be white, it's got to be more towards the darker side. And all that is to make the construction kind of blend in with the desert so you don't see it. Obviously a white house, even if it's beyond a tree, it'll come through like gangbusters, because when the sun hits it, it's all you see is a white house.
I believe there's a light ordinance too, correct? There's a lighting ordinance too, as far as
lighting, yes. It's also a dark skies area.
Yeah.
That's right. So there's a lighting thing to it. If you go north, the dividing line is actually the power line corridor that kind of goes diagonally from the Cap Canal down by Taliesin up to Pinnacle Peak Road. And everything north of that power line corridor is in Eslo and in the dark skies area. So we don't have a lot of light poles and things like that you'll find in other parts of the city. Again, a benefit. A lot of people like to be able to see the stars. Now, you still got Phoenix that's kind of degrading that, but you can see a lot more up there because of the dark skies area that they put in.
Well, Howard, it sounds like back then you said 1997 and the Hillside Ordinance. It sounds like
well, that's 1977.
So it was 77. Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah, and that shows you how early it started. And quite frankly, as it got later on in the 80s, Herb Drinkwater was a big driver of this, and I think we all owe him a lot of debt of gratitude for having the foresight to see that we've got to do something to protect this land, because it really is unique. Scottsdale is fortunate to have one of the few real Sonoran desert areas, certainly in the valley and even within the state. Tucson is the only one that comes close because, again, of their mountains. So it really is something that's unique and we should protect, and it's something people come to see. They don't want to go to Casa Grande because there's nothing there but dirt. You go up to where the mountains are and you can see a lot of desert vegetation. So.
Well, it sounded like when you started with the Hillside Ordinance, by the name it sounds like, well, it was the hillside.
It was to protect the McDowells.
And then the Environmentally Sensitive Land Ordinance, the SLO, expanded on that. So it wasn't just a hillside, it was pretty much everything, like you said.
It kind of did. A Hillside Ordinance did come down into the foothills because it was part of being the hillside. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, when they did Eslo, first of all, the city acquired more land too. In 1977, they didn't have all the land north of.
That's correct.
Where the annexations.
Right.
Yeah.
So once they annexed all that land north, and all that fell within the Eslo boundary, and Cave Creek, Carefree have much the same environment, very, very lush vegetation because of their mountain.
Well, I agree. We owe a debt of gratitude to our city forefathers, because we wouldn't have all this without it. And I think today, that's one of our big problems, is especially the influx of visitors coming in and wanting to buy property. They don't understand that. They don't understand why we do that. And especially, if you buy an acre of land and want to build a house, and we say, well, 40% you can't touch. They don't understand it, so I think that's why we need to know the history.
The details of development are quite complex and a lot different. There's two kinds really. There's unsubdivided property, which means they're individual lots that'll be bought and sold as individual lots. And then there's subdivided property, where somebody buys a large chunk of land and then divides it up into a number of houses. The subdivisions, to some degree, are easier to deal with, because you're saying you're entitled to a number of units based on the zoning. So if I have 10 acres in a zone R143 1-acre lots, I can have 10 houses. But now you can kind of cluster those 10 houses so you can leave some open space. And the open space provides a lot of privacy, because it's vegetation between you and your neighbor that kind of gives you the privacy naturally. But then there's also wildlife that moves through it. So a lot of the people that move up there might not understand all that initially, as you say,
sure,
but they fall in love with it once they're there.
Yeah.
And so they really, I would say the vast majority of residents have really embraced this once they've become part of it and understand what their benefits are to them.
Sure.
Now the subdivisions, again, you can cluster the stuff, you can get around washes. One of the major things in Eslo is protecting property. And the protection, everybody says, well, the sun shines here, what do you have to protect for water? Well, when it does rain, it rains hard, and the ground is hard, and it runs. And it can actually, where I live, it can actually go to a foot high over the entire ground, not just in the washes. So unless you control that runoff and have it go down the washes, every house could be really at jeopardy for damage from floods. So the idea was you protect the existing flood control mechanisms, which is the wash, and leave them in their natural state. And then the water flows down those washes, and you actually, if you're going to do development, you direct water into them or to a retention basin that eventually releases it. So that's a way of justifying the ordinance in another way, saying it's really there to protect property as well as preserve the environment.
Howard, that's a really good point. I think a lot of people don't realize that, but that's a very good point, is that, yeah, as we build out, we have to have that space for the water to saturate, because especially visitors out of town might not know that, 3 inches below ground is caliche, and the water doesn't soak through that. So it only soaks to a certain point, and then it starts building up. Like you said, you can have a foot high of water, and it stands for a while, And this will be a couple of segments. This is the first segment. The other segments will get more into that open space and the challenges behind that, and what the city is doing for that.
One other thing I could add before we leave that topic is, again, the foresight of some of our forefathers. When they annexed that whole area, they downzoned it. It generally comes in from the county as 1 acre, and they downzoned a lot of it because of the topography and the difficulties in developing in that. So if the lots are larger, people are willing to give up some of that space, especially if it's in boulders or washes and stuff like that. As the lots get really small, you don't even have a place to put it, much less anything else. So the idea was to keep it zoned fairly low density so that you could preserve some of the environment, so that you could preserve the washes, and in general the lifestyle that's up there with that. So again, a lot of foresight was there, and they essentially required larger lots where the topography gets a little more difficult, where the slopes are there, where there's lots of valleys, where there's big deep wash. Some of them are big deep washes, and you don't want people developing in those, because then they affect the properties that are upstream.
So Croy, you've been with the city for over 20 years, and working on our Sonoran Preserve. How successful do you think these programs are?
And again, there's many layers to that. You start with the core of the hillside, as you mentioned, the protection of the McDowell Mountains themselves. That's an easy one to take a look at, and you look at the ridge line of the McDowells, and the vast majority of the upper slopes.
Is that what the hillside originally covered, was the McDowells?
Well, it covered more, but it certainly was, by its title, aimed at the focus of protecting the McDowell Mountains. And they were the backdrop to Scottsdale. Correct. From a tourism standpoint, from the locals and their reference to them. They were very much something, and clearly we have the benefit of some of the other communities having developed ahead of us and seeing the encroachment on mountains in other communities. Scottsdale identified that. The forefathers said, we want to avoid that mistake, and we want to try and protect those areas. And so you look at just the basic of the protecting of the McDowell Mountains, and you start with that. It's been very successful. Not to say there hasn't been some encroachment in some areas, and some of that has to do with the challenge to the Hillside Ordinance and that history that was occurring in the 80s. But the ESL itself evolved beyond just the hillside, and Howard already identified many of the things.
ESL replaced the hillside.
Replaced the hillside,
yeah.
and that was in 1991 that really came into effect. And there was a big task force. There were people who lived out there, there were developer representatives, there were staff representatives, all involved in how do we make an ordinance that won't be challenged legally, that will allow for the variety of protections. Yeah. All of those things were taken into account. The legal department and outside zoning attorneys were involved in that task force to try and identify a way to make sure that we would avoid a legal challenge to our second effort. And ESL, I think, has been very successful on all those different things, on the colors, on whether you have smaller lots and then larger open space tracts in a subdivision situation, or whether you have the unsubdivided lots and you're providing open space on that. There's a lot of open space. Natural area open space exceeds, I don't have the exact acres, but it's over 10,000 acres that I've seen.
That so far, and that's
so this is 1991. This is really before DC Ranch, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And DC Ranch was part of the challenge to the hillside.
So you can picture how much open space land there actually was back then. And the city council and the residents who had to try to figure out how we're going to best protect this land and still, you know, realize that there will be development.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of density transfer on the mountains, for instance. So what they did is the McDowell Mountains Ranch is another example. They allowed the entitlement of how many homes you could build based on the acreage that they have, but you transfer that and you put it down on the slopes as opposed to in the mountains. And then the mountains they would dedicate to the city as part of the preserve. So it's part of the overall strategy to allow, and actually it's easier for the developer to try to develop on those slopes. It would be extremely difficult and also put the property at danger, because you make a cut or fill there and the stuff is going to be rolling down into the house. I mean, you know, so
Yeah.
it allowed them to put the homes in a safer location, and because it's master plan, DC Ranch, McDowell Mountain Ranch were both master plan. You master plan the whole drainage structure too.
Right.
And all of that NEOS is owned really by a common association, whatever that association is, and they have the ultimate responsibility to control it all, which is an advantage of not having it on lot, is that now an association is responsible to make sure that water flows through correctly to protect the residents.
So I don't know if this is a fair question to ask, but would you think that because of this ESL ordinance that replaced the Hillside Ordinance in 1991, that's why DC Ranch is so successful, because we did that and they had to master plan that community in accordance with that?
I would say in general, I've worked on many of the master plan communities in Scottsdale, that master planning a community gives us a lot of advantages. And certainly the expectations of the community for protecting the desert environment is something that most of those communities embraced. And they would end up, maybe they didn't start with that, but they ended up marketing the fact that they had large open space corridors, whether it's because of washes or view sheds to the mountains. They ended up charging premiums for those lots that had those views and things like that. But to the city's benefit, and from a long-term management of infrastructure costs, the fact that you get the streets and the water and sewer, and as Howard strongly pointed out, the drainage protections in place, all is very much an advantage. And those, you know, simply having a master plan on a large acreage gives you an advantage to having, say you have a 200-acre master plan community, and they're going to put 200 lots on there. Well, if you had to manage 200 individual homes coming in and building streets piece by piece and water sewer, that's just not very efficient.
Right.
And so having the gained efficiencies and the benefits of safety and much better water sewer streets, all of those things we would benefit from, and we pay better attention to the transportation needs and the fire safety needs. All of those things are part of that master planning review process. And so, but ESL, back to that question of what does that benefit, that's the sense of character, and that the Sonoran Desert is still there, that it wasn't simply an area that was flat graded and then turned into someone's new vision of what it should be. It was a matter of respecting the topography, the washes, the significant vegetation, boulder outcrops,
and the wildlife.
And the wildlife.
Yeah.
All of those things are benefits that come out of really the two things in my mind: master planning and the community's expectations as described, be it in the Hillside originally or in the ESL ordinance, that when you drive through North Scottsdale, and the sense of open space, natural character, that the Sonoran Desert is still there, has a lot to do with those early visions of the 70s of the community saying, no, we want to protect that. We want to annex it to control it, and we're going to create ordinances and general plans that speak to that. Much as we had a vision for the Indian Bend Wash, there was a community vision, and some of that comes from the 50s and 60s. You can find the history of protecting that back in the documents and the city planning efforts of those days as well. So those are all things that were included.
Okay. And you know, one thing I noticed too in my travels, in to your point, in the unincorporated areas, you don't have that.
No, you don't.
And people basically, they'll plan what they want, they'll put walls up When it does rain, the water doesn't know where to go, and it ends up flooding the neighbor's yard, and then they're having problems. So, to your point, I think it's very important in that the fact the city did it in the past, and that we still try to continue to do this, to maintain that, and to have a 200-acre master plan where you can actually have the natural washes and you can protect those, and it's just a good thing. I think Scottsdale's done a wonderful job with that so far. Howard, would you say that the ESLO, open space, and the NEOS have served Scottsdale well then?
Extremely well. Most of the people that move up there are amazed. In fact, I see more wildlife by my house than I see in the preserve when I hike it, because they've maintained, the washes are a natural wildlife corridor, and it's where they live also, because that's where water is and where things that have benefited off of water live. So when you maintain them in their natural condition instead of a cement channel or something like that, you get lots of wildlife that have learned, the wildlife has adapted to us and we've adapted to the wildlife. So we're now kind of living in harmony, which you don't see really anywhere else. Everywhere else, as Croy said, you just blade the whole lot, you put up your walls, and there's nothing that's going to encroach on that, and there's no place for the wildlife to go. The water is a big issue, which is why when we amended ESLO, we said you couldn't have perimeter walls around these things because that interrupts the water flow. And even on individual lots, you can put a wall around a portion of your lot, but not the whole thing. So there's places for water to flow around your house and your lot when it overflows the washes. So, I'd say all that has served very well. And like I said, most of the people I meet up there have, if they didn't understand it when they moved there, they really have bought into it and understand the benefits of it. And actually it increases property values because now people look to move up there. A lot of the tourists that come here wind up being residents, and the thing they see when they go north and see this beautiful Sonoran desert, well, hey, that's where I want to be. I want to be down south where it looks like Florida unless I can see the McDowell Mountains. I want to be in the natural environment where I can get the benefit. And the huge benefit that I saw when I moved out there, if you use all natural vegetation, and by the way, you're encouraged, the front yard is supposed to be all natural vegetation. The backyard, you can have some grass and some non-native stuff, but its height can't be more than 24 feet. But if you leave the natural vegetation, there's virtually no maintenance. Now, for people that come from a very wet environment, I mean, every weekend you're out there cutting stuff, the trees, you're raking leaves, you're cutting down bushes, you're cutting grass, you're fertilizing stuff. Well, you don't do any of that. It just, it takes its own natural course. When we first moved there, my wife looked out in the backyard and we have all this burst sage. She said, everything's dead, we're gonna have to rip it out. I said, it's been here a lot longer than we have. Why don't we wait and see what happens? Well, the monsoons, as soon as water appears, they come to life. They spring to life, and leaves appear where they weren't, and everything just pops.
Yeah, I think that's one of the amazing things about the desert. Yeah, you can look totally dead in the rain, and then next week it's all green again.
It's all green.
It's just amazing how that can just keep doing that like that.
And so, occasionally you get a complaint from somebody who has on-lot NEOS, and that's maybe a subject for another discussion. But the problem with on-lot is he says, this is my lot, I should be able to develop it. But the reality is he can't, because there's an easement on it that says you can't, you can't encroach on it. So you have that conflict. If you develop a subdivision that does not have on-lot NEOS, where it's all common property, you don't have any of that. And that's true where I live. I mean, you don't have any complaints at all about using of their lot, because their lot is bounded and they can do whatever they want on that lot, but the NEOS is in common property that they know they can't touch and that the association has to manage.
Yeah, and there probably isn't a day goes by that I don't go on Facebook and somebody posts a picture of, usually a bobcat or javelina or a coyote or something. And what I really noticed, especially about the coyotes, is that they're pretty fat. So, I guess by allowing this in Scottsdale, we've allowed them to grow and multiply, and the animals seem to be pretty happy too. So.
Well, nature manages itself if we leave it alone, and so the coyote population goes up and down depending on the rabbit and the little critter population, which goes up and down depending on other things. So the only people that typically have any, people will have a lot of water around, you have a pool and stuff like that, all sorts of critters are going to come to it because there isn't any other water in the desert, so they all come to that. And you say, how come I got so many squirrels, and I got rabbits, and I got coyotes trying to jump the fence to get them? Well, because you provided the water source.
Yeah. So it's pretty neat. This question isn't on here, but I'd like to ask both of you. So I'll ask you, Croy, first, and that's just, What do you think we can do moving forward? Do you have any suggestions about how we can make this better, or do you think we should just continue with it the way it is?
Well, there's a number of things that we haven't talked about. Clearly, this history led to the preserve and the protection of another 30,000 acres that the city has done.
Which is a story in itself.
It's another story in itself. Yeah. And, from a standpoint that a large majority of the land in Scottsdale has now been developed. And by that, it's either protected as preserve, it's protected as NAOS, it's been developed, be it for residential or other uses. And there are still lands that have not been developed, but they're the minority of the lands. And so now we start moving into, as homes will be redeveloped or properties will be redeveloped, and you have equestrian properties or other things that may change, it'll be that evolution. And how do we manage, as generations come on, there will be differences, be it our cell phones and how we transportation works. How do we evolve some of those, but do we continue to respect the natural environment? And I think that's just continuing to be aware of those trends, identifying them, and looking at ways that we can protect the environment, protect be it the physical or the view shed versus protecting the wildlife and things like that. Some of that has to be, education. Don't feed the wildlife. You don't need to put water and other things out for them. As Howard talked about the bird cage, they've been there a lot longer than we have. And I know the bobcats and the coyotes and everything are cute, but by putting food sources out there, you're encouraging them to rely on that, and you're bringing them into your neighborhood in an unnatural way, allowing them to travel the washes and feed off the natural vegetation. That's fine, but you don't want to encourage them. So it's those types of things that we just need to keep. Part of it's education. As you noted, there's people who move here that aren't aware of this history and that education, and it's keeping that awareness up. And as our technologies and our lifestyles evolve, we'll need to be aware of how we can adjust to some of that.
Those are very good points, and that's really the concept behind me doing these programs is to get that education out there, especially for people who come in from other states and maybe don't understand, hey, you know what? We're living in the desert here, and we understand we're living in the desert, and we've made these land ordinances to protect that area, and now that you're here, you're part of that, so the education is very important. What do you think, Howard?
Yeah, it's very important. Most people that buy an individual lot up there don't know about this, and I've often said to the city, when that lot changes hands, you should send them a little packet and say, okay, now this is where you are, and these are what your restrictions are. I would say, though, that most people that move there, as I said, they were tourists first, so they saw it. There was something they liked about it, and that's why they wanted to move to the area. They might not have understood everything they liked about it. Some of it was you could see the whole sky, you can see sunsets and sunrises because there's nothing in your way. There's nothing blocking your view. Some of it is just the desert itself has a very relaxing nature to it if you get out in it. They might not understand all that, but once they get there, they do understand it, and they love having the wildlife around. They love, the views they have of the mountains and the sky. So they start to buy into it a lot more once they're there. But education really is important, and I would say that one thing that really could be improved in the ordinance is that if you do a subdivision, that the NAOS be in common track and not on lot. That's a huge thing, because it changes. First of all, you won't have these people coming to you saying, I have this other part of the lot, why can't I use it? And the other part is that you have one entity now that has to maintain the water flow, and that's a huge thing, because you don't have individual lots that you go, hey, you're blocking the wash, you got to clean that up and stuff. You just have one entity that's responsible for it, and the city knows that, and they can go to them. And the city, by the way, inspects washes periodically.
So we can say, because of the foresight of residents and city government back in the 70s, we still have our beautiful desert today. And so looking into the future, we have to make sure that we maintain that and we be good stewards of it. This is, like I said, the first part of 3 segments, excuse me, and we'll get more into how to do that properly, like you said, with subdivision, putting in one area instead of putting on each individual property owner, and that'll come up next time. But what I'd like you to do, if you have time, is to send me an email, and that would be gphillips@scottsdaleaz.gov, with your ideas and your questions, and we can incorporate that into our next show. And we can get this education out, and hopefully in the future we'll be able to maintain this, and Scottsdale will remain the quality lifestyle that we've come to know and grow and love. So I'd like to thank Mr. Myers, Mr. Ekbloff for coming here today. I know you guys are busy, and so I really appreciate your time. And we'll be back with a further analysis of the NAOS, the open space, and the ESLO. But until then, thank you very much for listening.